with that, I would suggest that we get kicked off, and I would say we'll go to Australia first. So Jessica McLean, Macquarie University, she's a senior lecturer and director of outreach and engagement at her university. Jess is probably best known for her recent book, Changing Digital Geographies, Technologies, Environments and People. And she does research on humans, more than humans, environments and technologies, and how they interact to produce geographies of change. Her research focuses on digital technologies, water politics, climate action and activism. And anyone who's read her book will be extremely excited to hear from her more generally right now. So thank you very much for joining us, Jess.
This talk questions whether we can decolonise digital technologies using a case study of digital geographies of Indigenous knowledges and settler colonial practices in higher education. My name is Jess McLean. I'm from the Department of Geography and Planning at Macquarie University. First, I'd like to acknowledge country. Wurundjeri country, where Macquarie University sits. Gadigal country, where I'm talking with you from today. And Wiradjuri country, that grew me up. I want to acknowledge traditional custodians of these countries and recognise their continuing connections to land, waters and community, especially important as I am a non-Indigenous woman engaging with these questions of decolonisation. I'd like to thank Dorothea and Hannah for inviting me to talk today on this topic, and also the Digital Geographies Research Group. So this screenshot on this first slide is from the making of a film called Collisions. It's an immersive technologies film that uses drones to capture cultural burning on Martu country. It's a film made by Lynette Walworth and with Nyari Morgan. It's Nyari's story that is the centre of this film. I'll talk more about the content of the film in the body of this talk, but it was a key moment in shifting a resource management unit for third and master's level students in 2019. So to situate this research in the literature on digital technologies and questions of Indigenous resistance, I'd like to engage briefly with Carlson and Drea's introduction to their Media International Australia special issue on how Indigenous people have harnessed the affordances of social media to resist colonialism and to imagine new futures. They cite a number of really important and interesting examples of how this has happened. Bronwyn Carlson is an amazing scholar who leads Indigenous studies at Macquarie University, and I really encourage you to seek out her work if you haven't come across it already. So some of the ways in which social media and digital technology more broadly provide avenues for resistance to racism in many settings are cited here. Another one that I offer in my book, Changing Digital Geographies, is Indigenous Dads hashtag. What happened was that a really racist cartoon was circulated in mainstream media in Australia, and in response and countering these, many Indigenous Australian men, women and children shared their stories, their images, their narratives around what their dads meant to them under the hashtag Indigenous Dads. So it's important to bring to light how social media has a really strong double-edged sword, just like any form of digital technology in the worlds in which we live today. There are moments of empowering and generative thought and connection. There are also moments of destruction and negativity. So one way we might theoretically consider these processes is to look at the concept of platform colonialism. So Sujon, in a paper published in 2019, talks about the way Google infiltrates classrooms and becomes a ubiquitous educational tool, which has unintended consequences, including creating path dependency, perhaps unintended for people outside of Google. For those of you who have children in primary school, I'm sure you've seen how frequently Google becomes a key tool in their educational practices. This form of platform colonialism can lead to a deepening of unequal power relations and can reduce critical thinking, according to Sujon. I think these are really important critiques that I want to keep in mind throughout this talk. At the same time, we've got these interventions that are generative. So for instance, in New South Wales, Australia, we have the National Parks and Wildlife Service providing an opportunity through Wildercrest, which is an online platform, to share Aboriginal storytelling relevant to national parks. So colonial hegemony has been widely critiqued in relation to national parks in Australia, but at the same time we have this institution providing moments of self-determination and sharing those in this creative way. So we've got contradictions throughout the way digital technologies are used. So the small case study I'm sharing today considers what opportunities we might have to unsettle geographical knowledges in the classroom by using digital technologies, building on Deigel and Sundberg's work. Indigenous scholars leading Indigenous content units and courses is the best way to decolonise geographical higher education, reading and experiencing Indigenous people's scholarly work and art and citing it. I take on board Noxolo's powerful critique that actually ceding territory and materially transforming institutions in Indigenous people's lives is a powerful and important way that universities could decolonise. So this case study that I'm offering you is just a small way in which we could think about disrupting the way teaching and learning has been conducted traditionally and forward some of these decolonisation efforts. There's obviously a lot more that needs to be done. So by way of overview, in 2019, in this unit called Rethinking Resource Management, which is a third year and master's level unit, it has internal and external cohorts, and about 120 students were enrolled. I offered 2 key moments for students to use virtual reality to help facilitate deeper connection with the unit goals and the outcomes that we wanted students to achieve in this learning process. So the first one was watching a film called First Contact, which is a 5-minute long film, and it captures the experiences of Indigenous leaders, including Bruce Pascoe, Nakia Louie, and sharing their stories directly to the student through this short 5-minute film. The second opportunity was in a film called Collisions that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Collisions is a beautiful film, highly recommend if you can access it. The making of is freely available on YouTube, and it's an award-winning film that captures Nyari Morgan's story in a very compelling way, and that was offered in the 4th week of semester. The other option that students had was to watch a film called Talu, which was provided through the library and was partway through the semester, so not many students actually watched that film. So in this research study, students were able to refuse engaging with this virtual reality content. Some students had challenges experiencing it as they were external students and had to independently source means of watching it or come to the university to use the virtual reality room there. And then after watching these films and thinking about what it means to decolonise, students were asked to complete a survey towards the end of semester. So I'll be talking about these results now. One of the questions in the survey was, how can we decolonise the classroom in higher education? In the students' responses, there were some really rich and reflective thoughts offered. One student said, I think the use of VR is a really good way through which to allow different spokespersons to offer opinion without being dependent upon physical presence of individuals. Another said that increasing the number and frequency of Aboriginal and Indigenous voices on all topics, too many are from a solely Western perspective. One said, look, this is a really tough question to answer, I'm not overly sure how to go about this. And another emphatically said, with this. So we can see a range of responses, but overall students were positive in how they engaged with the material. So one student said specifically, when questioned about how they found the virtual reality films in the unit, they said it was useful as it provides a greater interaction and understand with content as opposed to a reading or workshop. Gives a physical sense almost. Visually provided a greater experience and connection and understanding of the discussion. I think those embodied and affectual aspects are really important here. And it's something that in lieu of doing fieldwork, which obviously wasn't possible this year, but also hasn't been possible in previous years because of other constraints, that using immersive technologies can be a useful way to get into these transformative moments. For me as a convener of this unit, I found that there were some really positive and not so positive aspects of teaching with VR headsets. So one constraint I had was that the Oculus Go headsets that we used for the second film experience were all in a 20-kilogram box, and I had to lug it around the university upstairs and those sorts of things. Students were very generous in helping me take them back to my office, but it was a significant constraint when thinking about these conveniences of digital technologies. It was technically feasible thanks to an invisible network of tech support that became more visible as I started building that network within the university. It was contingent on those connections as well, of course. So it was really dependent on students' orientation to the tech as well. So VR use really comes with friction, both embodied and in terms of how people feel about that form of technology, their orientation to it. I think the best practice for working on sharing Indigenous excellence with VR is to have Indigenous produced ethical content and have a room set aside specifically for VR technologies. So this research project is just a small gesture to think about how we might change higher education to improve efforts of decolonisation. So it shouldn't replace instruction by Indigenous people who are properly paid for their work. I think that if you want to use ethical, appropriate digital technologies, and the more tools available to decolonise higher education, the better. I think it is useful from this small study as it reaches those who might not be so engaged with the other forms of tutorial activities such as role plays or conversations. Students who really respond to tech really loved using the VR headsets. And it's interesting to note that other research has shown that it's useful to use immersive technologies in the classroom. Crucially, there must be more support for developing Indigenous-led virtual reality, and research on decolonising with VR is needed. In conclusion, digital spaces are facilitating new avenues for Indigenous resistance to colonial hegemonies and possibilities for community building. But Indigenous people also continue to experience intense levels of racism and threats of violence directly as a result of engaging with digital spaces. So that double-edged sword is really important to understand and to challenge. The polar possibilities of the more than real, thinking about digital geographies as not unreal or inferior to face-to-face learning practices or engagement, but more than real, as you can be transported and challenge traditional geographies. The polar possibilities of the more than real are evident in how digital geographies both enable and constrain decolonial efforts and these challenges to colonial hegemonic power, which is something I talk about in my book, Changing Digital Geographies. Thanks for engaging with this talk, and here's the references for it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jess. And I'm going to sort of clap in the name of everyone. Some of you might have worked out that Zoom has a clapping hand symbol and so on, but you might find that over time. But thank you very much, Jess, and a wonderful way also to connect different parts of different subdisciplines that meet in the digital geographies as well. So the decolonization discussion is of course across geography, but geographers who are working in sort of development space, etc., are very much concerned with that at the moment, or more for some time now. And at the same time, we have quite a long tradition in our group talking about VR and games. So bringing those two perspectives together in your talk is really lovely and gives us lots of ways of engaging, and potentially we might also want to talk more about activism. I will contain my enthusiasm and move on to the next speaker, who is going to be Professor Balaji Parthasarathy from India, and I'm delighted that Balaji agreed to speak to us. We've known each other for quite some time, working in this space around information technology and international cooperation and development. Balaji's interest is on focusing on the relationship between technological innovation, economic globalization, and social change. And in recent work, he's examined the political economy of the digital platform economy, frugal innovation, and smart cities. But we gave a very open portfolio as to what colleagues might speak about. So I'm just very keen to hear, Balaji, what you would like to contribute to this discussion.
Thank you, Dorothea. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here amongst many people whose names I recognize, some of whom I know very well. And what I thought I'd bring to the discussion today is to sort of draw from my own career. I've been working with the digital really for the last 25 years. I'm fairly old, if that doesn't tell you that. And looking at my first point of entry into looking at the digital and work that I'm currently doing and looking at what the implications have been for research and for day-to-day practices. I'm not going to be touching upon teaching in this discussion. And my first entry was to look at the software industry and its growth in India, particularly in Bangalore. Now I'm looking at the platform economy. And so by comparing these two, I think there are certain insights we can gain. These are in 10 minutes, these are definitely only going to be very broad brush strokes, and I will keep it as short as possible, preferring a discussion instead. So let's go back to 1995 when I was a doctoral student along with Matt in the same department. And I was embarking on a dissertation to understand why Bangalore had grown rapidly as a center for global software production. In fact, people were referring to it as India's Silicon Valley, and there's a whole bunch of hype around that, right? So it's sudden sort of rise to prominence became a talking point, and I said, what's going on? And typically, most sort of people who wrote about it talked about, identified certain elements. There was the availability of digital infrastructure in the country. Suddenly from the early 90s, we had broadband communication, which made it possible to provide software from a place like India to primary markets, which are all in the West, Europe to some extent, and primarily in the United States, right? It's a very export-oriented effort. Then there were, from the early 1990s, when there was a whole bunch of policy changes within the country, there were also a number of incentives that were given to firms that attracted a number of domestic firms into the software industry and brought along through the 1990s and in the early 21st century, a number of multinational companies to get into the production of software. So there was that side of it. And then finally, everybody wrote about the Indian software engineer, the relatively large pool of people with the right kind of skills to meet the needs of customers as they were evolving. So there were these three elements. But what my dissertation really required me to do was to actually go ahead and investigate and talk to these people, people in the industry, to understand what is it that they were doing with the infrastructure, with the incentives. How are they taking advantage of this time difference with the US, the temporality of this whole industry, in order to actually create a particular organization of production? What is the division of labor? What is it that you could do in Bangalore that you couldn't do in the US, and vice versa? How are things actually being organized and done, right? So that was what I was really interested in. And to some extent, I didn't really have to understand that much of the technology, because the people in the industry, almost entirely a white-collar industry, I could reach out to try and ask them. They were creating the technology. I could ask them, what is it that you are doing? How is it that you're responding to the needs of customers? And they would sit and explain to me. Of course, some of the CEOs would be very patronizing towards a doctoral student. And then there were, of course, a whole bunch of other engineers I could talk to on a more, say, an even plane. Here I would sort of very quickly highlight or sort of emphasize the fact that we could talk to, or I could talk to people in a largely white-collar industry because we shared certain social coordinates, right? And those social coordinates have to do, in India, with the intersection of class and caste, right? So we can then, once you share these coordinates, then you can invoke a set of references, either personal networks or other things, by which you can actually try and understand what is happening in the industry, right? and in the production of software. How is it that you use digital infrastructure to develop or to deliver digital services? The industry itself was largely an enclave economy. There was some multiplier effects through things like chauffeurs, those providing, you had nannies taking care of the kids at unearthly hours. You had people who were providing security services and so on. So you did have that, and you did see that construction labor to provide housing for these guys, right? But all the focus was on the white collar segment of the industry. Now this was, the 90s. Okay. Now let's fast forward now to this decade, and in the last maybe year or two, I've been spending a lot of time working on the platform economy. Okay. Now this industry, or sort of this segment of the digital industry, if you might, is different in the sense the market, at least the geographically tethered version of it, is primarily within the country. And what are they doing? They're providing a variety of services. Increasingly, this is evident in many parts of the world, whether it's ride hailing or whether it's domestic services like plumbing, carpentry, etc., to delivery services. And then you have a number of firms like in the software, the IT industry. You have people who are multinationals like the Ubers of the world, the Amazons. You also have a large number of domestic companies who can give the multinationals a run for their money, right? So you have this whole segment that has come to play. And the interesting thing is, one of the reasons why I was attracted to this is that it has grown so rapidly that today it employs far more than the software industry employs 35 years after it sort of first blossomed in the country. Right? So so we're not talking about small change at all, and it's different in characteristics. Like I said, it caters largely to a domestic market, the provision and sort of delivery of services, often to the people who are working in the IT industry and so on, who have the disposable income but a short on time and are seeking these kinds of sort of local services. So that's what sort of really got me attracted. Now, so let's think about it again in terms of the three sort of the variables, if you might, that I was using. So one, I figured if you have to understand this, you have to understand the digital technology. What is it that these guys are using, right? Just like you had the digital infrastructure, the broadband communication that was earlier available for the software industry, you now have, these platforms, digital platforms through which a lot of the transactions, or almost all the transactions, are conveyed and negotiated. Of course, the availability of mobile telephony in the country has immensely helped. It's put a phone in everybody's hand, but it's really these platforms, these digital platforms, that are driving the infrastructure. So that's one. Okay. The second thing is the public policy. Like I said, in the earlier instance, you had policies that gave incentives. What struck me and what continues to sort of, what is intriguing is the fact that there's almost no policies that are governing this industry today. And all these have implications, and I'll come and sort of tie it up at the end. Right? Then, of course, you have a very large labor force, like I've already mentioned. Now, what separates this labor force from the one that works in the ICT or the IT, the software industry, is that there's only a very small sliver of it that's actually white collar, the guys who are actually founding and running the companies. The vast majority are actually blue collar workers, people who have rather limited education, many of whom are actually migrants from agrarian backgrounds, okay, who are coming into mostly the largest metropolitan cities, which account for a vast share of these services, to sort of run around. And earlier they would work in other sort of, low-wage manufacturing, etc., in what you might call the informal sector, but they're now flocking to this segment to seek work opportunities, right? Simply because in India today, 85% of employment is in broadly what you call the informal sector, right? It's unorganized. It doesn't come within a whole bunch of, it doesn't follow a whole bunch of regulations. Okay, so now, back when I was a doctoral student, I thought I had a hard time studying the industry, right? But it now occurs to me that was fairly easy compared to what we are up against now. And let me explain, and that's what I really would like to talk about in terms of the implications of what this digital technology now means for research. First and foremost, the digital infrastructure that I spoke about, the platforms, they're not necessarily static in a sense. Your machine learning algorithms that, the more you sort of feed data into them, start to generate new sets of patterns that even sometimes the firms themselves are unable to understand because they're seeking and buying the software from other sources. Somebody else is providing that to them, and they outsource the software, the development of the software and its maintenance to other sources. They simply set a bunch of parameters along which they expect the work allocation to take place, right? This brings into question a number of ethical issues, both from my side as a researcher, trying to say, what am I trying to understand? It's, to sort of, do I even understand what's going on, right? And this is a big issue, right? To sort of, to take or to quote Lawrence Lessig out of context, code is not law. Code has become sort of the regulator really of these relationships between labor and capital, right? So and nobody seems to fully understand how this is going, because the nature of that infrastructure has changed very fundamentally, right? Second, public policy. We don't really have any public policy governing these relationships because it's contractual. Most of these blue-collar workers are not employed. They're all sort of contractors. They're seen as partners, and there's all kinds of euphemisms that are used, right? It's anybody. You can do pretty much what you want, right? Which becomes harder to study. It's not like you can tick off a box and say, oh, this law, this act has been followed. Much of it is ignored, right? And there's nothing at all.
Balaji, one more minute.
Yeah, okay, fine. Last bit. And then finally, you have the blue-collar workers. You can't even ask them what the issues are. And there are two parts here that are like quickly finishable. First, even though we are talking about geographically tethered economies, the problem is there's an enormous social distance between somebody like me and them. Although I'm an Indian, they're Indians, the levels of education, etc., are vastly different. And what is even more complicated now in the times of the pandemic, on that social distance, you have physical distance, because many of these migrants have now chosen to go back to their villages or wherever it is that they come from. So it makes studying this sort of platform economy even more of a challenge. So what I'd like to really sort of sum up in the last sentence or two is to say that there was a certain digital sort of an economy or a sort of a digital geography that existed earlier that has changed now, and studying what we now have has become immensely more challenging due to a set of infrastructural and social and contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balaji, and brings us very much up to date as well to where we are at the moment. So again, I'm clapping for the group here.
Thank you, Dorothea.
So think about your questions, maybe start putting them in the chat. Hannah will be passing them on, but first we will have one speaker after another. So the next question is, the next speaker is going to be Fiona Ssozi from Makerere University in Uganda. Fiona is an assistant lecturer in the School of Computing and Informatics Technology. Her research focuses on using co-design to leverage the potential of ICT tools within the rural water management sector, and also with marginalized and vulnerable groups, such as the visually impaired, rural residents, and smallholder dairy farmers. And I've had the pleasure to talk and work with Fiona recently. I'm really keen to hear what you would like to contribute to our conversation. Fiona, over to you. 10 minutes, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dorothea and Hannah, for the opportunity to be a part of Geographers. I am not a geographer, but I'm happy to be here. So a bit about me. I'm Ugandan and born and bred in Uganda. I'm a lecturer at Macquarie University, and I have been here actively teaching since 2007. I was retained after my undergraduate. So I started as a tutorial assistant, and then I got a scholarship to go to the UK to do a master's in information systems. And then I came back, and then I got a permanent position. So I've been teaching in Macquarie since 2007. I went away in 2014 to do a PhD at University of Cape Town, which I am finishing. But in this talk, I'll just quickly talk about how I have engaged with the digital in my teaching and my research work, which is mainly in co-design, which is a form of participatory design, but also community informatics. As Dorothea read in my bio, I am passionate about working with disadvantaged groups or marginalized communities. So how I have engaged with the digital, I hope my screen is clear, is it?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. I've done some work with smallholder dairy farmers in Western Uganda, and here we were introducing a tool to help them. It was an information management platform to help them keep track of their production, to keep track of their animals and animal health and track productivity, because a lot of them were losing money, not knowing what's going on. They hire farm managers, and people milk cows and are not recording information anywhere. So farm owners or farm managers were losing money. They were not able to track what's going on their farms. So I worked with SNV to develop a tool for these farmers in 7 districts in Western Uganda. I've done a lot of work in rural water management. My first interaction here was developing an SMS-based tool for people to report breakdowns in their water services. So if a borehole was not giving water or something is broken down, any resident was able to send a structured SMS to notify a pump mechanic or district water official, who would then also get a notification on their phone and then come and fix it. And that didn't turn out so well, because eventually we figured that people don't like texting, and then also sending structured SMSs by elderly people who live in these rural communities was not something that was working. A lot of them just prefer, getting their phone and just make a quick phone call of maybe 30 seconds and that's it. But with the way our system had been structured, with someone making a voice call, the system is not able to track that kind of information. So that kind of failed, and it's been a learning lesson. And that led me to using a different method of engaging with people, which is a more participatory, because it then gives me an opportunity or room to know what could be appropriate for that kind of environment. Structured SMSs have worked elsewhere, and in some communities they don't work, depending on if there are more younger people within these communities, then they're able to engage with USSD or text. But when you have a lot of older people there, it's easier to have systems that use, voice or audio or than text. I've also done another community water project in northern Uganda. Here I'm working with an organization called International Lifeline Fund, and we are supporting them in managing payments. If people are paying for their water services using mobile money or mobile payments, and then so basically finding an aggregator to facilitate that process, but then also send notifications when their water sources are not providing water. I've had another project, which was my PhD project. For all these, I use co-design as my preferred methodology, because I engage more, and then I don't just develop something and then put it in the community and it just doesn't work. Another which got me into the space of the visually impaired or people with a form of disability was a project with the visually impaired learners. So there's been several studies about how there's disparities in our education system, where you have a lot of children with disabilities not being able to continue with school, or they just drop out because the environment within our schools is not conditioned to support them. And I have a colleague that has started, she's gotten more into human-computer interaction and how to help people with visual impairment use the web. So we got together and started this project where we were thinking of exploring assistive technologies that would work best for students in northern Uganda. Now, this is a region within our country that experienced war. if you've had, I'm not sure you've heard of the Lord's Resistance Army or Kony rebels. So a lot of our people in that region lost families. A lot of the children are orphaned. But that's also an area that borders southern Sudan. So if you know where the location of Uganda, and there's been war in southern Sudan, so you also have a lot of refugees coming down, escaping the war, and a lot of children coming into these schools that have lost their parents. So being visually impaired, and you're basically being looked after a guardian. And the only form of education you have access to is what an NGO-funded school, that's what you have access to. But government is not providing a lot of technology support for these students. So, but we have a regulator that just, in the words of the head teacher, they dump computers. Now, for students like those, they would need assistive technologies, or they would need specialized software to be able to use these computers. But then it's not just software that you get from an American donor, I'm sorry to say, or someone outside. How do we then customize it to be usable by children in northern Uganda? So in exploring this project and what technologies would be appropriate and relevant and usable for the students, I ran a co-design workshop, and I was surprised when students were telling me that they only want a technology that they can use within the school. And for me, an educator, I was thinking, we don't want learning to only take place within the walls of the institution. How about when you go home? How do we continue supporting you when you're at home? And then I found out that when these students go home, they're locked up because they're disabled. The environmental communities don't think they can do anything. They're not allowed to play with other children. Unfortunately, a lot of disability in my part of the world is easily tied to witchcraft or spirituality. So then you have people in these neighborhoods telling these students that, no, you're cursed, so you can't be allowed to play with other children. So there's a lot of stigma around the students. And so with that situation, then the focus then moves to their educators, saying that whatever tool we develop for them, we can't put it on a mobile phone because they can't go home with it. When they go home, it's going to be taken away from them. So, so then rethinking about how digital works in different spaces. But then also, I forgot to say about the project I did in Western Uganda for water managers. I had a situation where a lady, a lady who was part of the workshops, she's a water manager, went home, and we had a bit of funding, and somehow she just stopped participating. And when I found out, when I tried calling the phone, I was told that the husband had taken the phone away from her. And incidentally, this still happens. Sometimes I get frustrated and I'm thinking, it's 2020, why do we still have these things happening? But a lot of these are cultural problems, if I should say. And just reflecting on my personal life as well, growing up, my father was a medical doctor, but I don't want to think it's this part of the world, or it's just my tribe, my culture, or where I come from. But in my own house, my parents' house, it's like the TV and radio and mobile phone belonged to my father. And he would, just say things like, don't spoil my TV, or, don't break my radio, or leave my phone alone. And the other things in the house were for my mother, like, if you jump on my chair, if you break my cup. And so reflecting on what's happening in these communities and how technology is seen as a thing for a man. And if I'm engaging in a space where there's going to be a lot of women, say agriculture, and we're developing tools for them to access agricultural information or market information, I have to be very aware of some of these, patriarchal things that happen in these spaces, and then be able to respond, but also be sensitive and not throw my might be a little more exposed. And, you know, I'm quick to say, but if it's your wife that's managing the farm, if it's your wife that's managing water finances from the community, she should be allowed to, you know, have access to this mobile phone and engage with this, you know, information. But I also have to be careful about how I approach that.
Can I give you one more minute because you're out of time?
Oh, okay, so my lessons, managing expectations, and also reciprocity taking on different forms depending on which region of the country I'm going into, or which tribe or which religion, and also managing the intersection of the digital with religion and culture. About teaching, I certainly engage with the digital. In Makerere University, we use an e-learning platform. We have students engaging in WhatsApp groups, and also some of us academic staff being part of those WhatsApp groups as well. But with COVID, it's exposed our weaknesses in just even operationalizing online learning. First of all, it's been a politicized situation where the president actually said universities don't even think about online learning or assessment during this time. Safety for students, also with a bit of inequality. We have students that come from very remote areas. They're not able to access internet where they are, and so we cannot even think about running online courses. The cost of connectivity is still high for us. We have poor policies. People will compare us to Rwanda. We are equally landlocked, but Rwanda's internet connectivity is much cheaper than ours, but we have poor policies, we have poor regulation. And I would just say this. One time someone tweeted that choosing an internet provider in Uganda it can be equated to choosing which STD to contract. As much as it's as gross as it might sound, that's the reality, that it's just difficult finding a service provider that will, you know, give you quality of service at an affordable cost. So if we, the staff, are struggling to even just remain connected, then what about our students? So there's not been any teaching during this pandemic. We're still locked down. We don't know how long it's going to take, but certainly COVID has exposed our need to rethink about, you know, we say we are doing e-learning, but it's more than just dumping content on an e-learning platform. But yeah, so what the approach the university is taking is training staff or colleagues who feel they're not able or they're not conversant with engaging with an online platform and managing really online learning, and we'll see how that goes.
Thank you, Fiona. Lots more, and I hope we'll have a little bit of time, at least in questions, or possibly also the break to hear more. So thank you very much on behalf of all of us. Yes, with that, I'd like to go to our fourth speaker, and that's Zook from the University of Kentucky, where he's a university research professor in the Department of Geography. And Matt's research centers on evolving economic and social practices afforded by information technology and big data. I'm sure Matt's going to talk some more about his research and his take, but as again, we've kept it quite wide open. 10 minutes from you, Matt, and we hope to then go into a few questions.
Okay. My mic is on, yes, okay. Thanks very much for the invitation. We're really happy to be part of this panel. Dorothea had mentioned earlier that I'm actually the chair for the AAG's Digital Geography Specialty Group. And so, you know, I guess with all the officialness I can muster, it's great to be, you know, great to have the opportunity. I had the opportunity to join, I think it was 2 years ago, for one of these same workshops in person. So it's great to keep this up. I also just wanted to say that right now the Digital Geography Specialty Group is putting out a small grant competition, or grant, not competition necessarily, but a proposal for grants. I just put the tweet with the information in the chat room. This is this is focused on, essentially, we had some money left over because we didn't have the AAG this year. And so we wanted to put out some grants for people working on the theme of racial justice as it ties into digital geographies. You can see all the details, but just wanted to pass that on. I'm going to do a quick screen share. Let me see. Share this. Is that working?
Yeah, so I've got a slide that says 3 key principles.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to run through this quickly because sometimes it's easier to both see it in terms of text and what I say. The first one I put out here mainly because as Balaji outed me, I have been doing this stuff for some time at this point. And back in the 90s when we were both PhD students, this idea that the digital is the world and the world is digital is something that was very different. It was all about going online. It was all these sort of metaphors about online space and digital space being very different. And I put this out here because I suspect a lot of people, especially students, postgrads, doing work right now, this is not something they really think about. But this is sort of where we're coming from. And I also just want to sort of add in this second idea that there's sort of a seduction of the digital and the seduction of big data, that there's somehow, and maybe this is just an affliction of people from my generation, that it seems sort of like, sort of smooth and technologically sort of nicely packaged together. Whereas folks who are, grew up with it and are using it, more in sort of daily life, it's not that same sort of seduction. But I think it's still there, particularly when it comes around big data, big numbers. Everyone sort of, seems very powerful. And so that's more just something I think we should keep in mind as we do, all these sorts of things, both in terms of research and teaching. That there's sort of we're invited to give it more power than we necessarily deserves, and we really should be spending a lot of time thinking about those moments that we're not thinking all that critically about how the digital is being used in our lives or being used in our research. And that's just sort of a general principle that I go forward with this. The second one is really situating the digital. This sort of builds on the first one. It's not, and again, this is, might be sort of preaching to the choir here within geography, that the digital isn't independent of its, histories and context. It comes from a certain places. It's socially constructed, however we want to talk about this. And that's a really important aspect of how we approach it. I mean, again, this is something that we're using, we're creating, particularly within, sort of forms of social media that are being used. It's something that there are certainly sort of centralized forces, centralized powers that have a lot of influence about what we see, how we experience this. And that's also coming from a particular place. I mean, there's, people talk a lot about the sort of influence of the Silicon Valley libertarian mindset on the way these apps and tools are being designed. So, keep that in mind. And the last is what I'm just going to call, that we should be thinking about going beyond. And this builds on this idea of going beyond the geotag, which is based on an article that I was a co-author on with a bunch of other people coming out of Kentucky, including Jeremy Crampton, who I think is on this call right now. Not sure if anyone else is, but the idea, I mean, at least for that article, sort of simply speaking, was just, we need to think about this. It came out right at the time when everyone was like sort of mapping social media for the first time, and we'd have lots of maps with like pins on a map, and it was really exciting. It was really powerful, but we also had, it was this idea that we can do more than just put pins on a map. How else do we use this sort of thing? I've messed up my order. Okay, anyway, so the more idea is going beyond the X. And so one of the ways that I'm doing this within my own sort of research and this work is going beyond just sort of residential data for studying urban phenomena. And yesterday I had the chance to sit in another virtual conference. This is one based out of Tartu, Estonia, called Mobile Tartu. And this is a lot of researchers working with mobile data, phone records, GPS tracking, other sort of things. And there's a lot of interesting work that's being done that is, essentially rather than choosing census data based on where people are sleeping, looking at how people are moving through urban space at during the day and during temporally. So you can see how mobility works, how people come together, even if they're segregated residentially. Sometimes they're coming together in certain spaces. What kind of spaces? How is behavioral space showing? It's a way to look at look at questions of particularly urban geography in this case. Gentrification is another nice example, using these kinds of data. So again, there's lots of potential for mixed methods here, and my whole order thing is messed up. Oh well. And I think this is actually sort of towards a research approach I want to sort of put across. I think it's an excellent time for particularly geographers, other social scientists to start working and collaborating with people coming from data science, computer science, and so forth. There's lots of interesting stuff out there. In general, my experience has been a lot of the computer scientists, people coming computer scientists, they're very good with the data and the algorithms. They're less good at asking sort of interesting social science or sort of geographical kind of questions. And bringing those groups to people together can, really have really open up some really interesting work. And I think this is particularly where geographical theory comes when thinking about space. I mean, how we, there's lots of interesting theories about the unevenness against scale and time. You get the Lewisian folds. You have relational networks. Other sort of ways that people have theorized space. And now we're getting to the point where we can actually sort of take some of these sort of data from these digital technologies and start analyzing them in new ways. Let's see. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Let me see how to do that. Where do I go back to? Oh, here we go. All right, I'm back. Okay. I then just want to follow up with a final couple points, because I think I'm almost out of my time, and just mention COVID-19. I mean, we obviously are just, at most 6 months into this pandemic. For a lot of us, we're sort of 3 months in, maybe 4 months in. But I think this is actually, this is really, this gets at everything, both, from research to teaching and practice. How are we doing this? It's clearly unprecedented events. This is all rolling out now. I would say if anyone is thinking about doing a research project on this for a thesis or dissertation, yes, please, that would be fantastic. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting questions. I mean, you will struggle with the fact that it's an emerging phenomenon. But I think the really interesting thing right now is that because it's being framed as a crisis, because it is a crisis in many ways, how you want to define it, there's these imperatives that are being rolled out that, we have to have these digital solutions. We have to, have the tracking apps. We have to figure out how to deliver education online. And a lot of this is happening very quickly, without a lot of oversight, without a lot of sort of thoughtful critique. A lot of times we'll have, consensus and consent, all this happens is so quickly that a lot of that gets pushed aside. You have all kinds of examples, like some of the tracing apps in European countries that are being put out and then being pulled back 2 or 3 months later because of all kinds of problems coming from this. And I think my final point is just, I think, echoing some of the other speakers, this idea about the platform on this. And I think this is really a really interesting moment, because we have these powerful forces, we'll call them the state and maybe capital or corporations, but particularly these platforms, these platform economies that are coming out. And, how is this going to, how do we negotiate privacy versus the platform? Because sometimes even you can have systems that are preserving individual privacy, but still provide enough data that allow platforms, because they have so much depth everywhere, they can sort of keep the individual private, but then have really powerful insight and powerful actions on the way society functions. So I'll stop right there and open it up to questions. Or, well, actually, I'll give it back to Dorothea, who will do what she wants.
Thank you very much, Matt. The renewed link between the AAG specialty group and the Digital Geographies research group here at the RGS. I think there were a lot of themes that were running through, quite divergent themes through the different talks, and also some that were sort of chiming through. In particular, questions I thought of justice and inequality, potentially also around intersectionality. It was really interesting. I would propose to attendees that we shave up 5 minutes of the break, and we take 5 minutes out of my closing remarks, because I can talk as much or as little at the end, and give ourselves a little bit of time for questions that way, and catch up with ourselves a little bit. If you want to go into the break early, that's fine. You know how to do this. Go on video, just turn off the video and mute yourself. We've all done it at some point in the past weeks. But for those of you who are keen, like I am, to just hear a little bit more from presenters, now's your chance. If you wanted to raise your hand, I hope I can see you. I'll put my participant list on, but I might need some help from Hannah. And otherwise, please indicate in the chat your question or that you want to talk.
Maxwell has his hand raised, Dorothea.
Okay, you want to go ahead, Maxwell?
Hi, thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, Dorothea. I just want to pose a question to Fiona, because in the chat, Annie Ebby asked a question regarding the statement she said about choosing an ISP in Uganda is like choosing which STD to contract. And from my experience, I think intersects with, say, maybe gender studies, because I know, say, in South Africa, there's a huge epidemic with young girls being susceptible to abuse, because to charge their phone, they need to go to local off licenses or stores, or, you know, even catching public transport. You know, they're susceptible to predatory men. So is that what your statement was discussing?
Yeah.
No.
So can I just respond? So the tweet was, it was just people airing the frustrations when it comes to choosing your data provider, because all of them promise you a 4G connectivity and actually it's not, and yet you spend a lot. So it was in the context of everyone is problematic. There's nothing that's So as I said, it's a gross comparison, and yet it caught the attention of, you know, a key policy person, and yet we're still here. Nothing is done. I find myself, I have 3 connections, and with OTT, I have to pay OTT for each of these lines. And at some point in the day, I have to switch to one network, another point in one different network. Yeah, so it was just to bring out the frustration with the service, the quality of service. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question for Balaji in the chat. Hannah, would you like to read out?
There's actually a couple of questions for Balaji. Did you
go for it? I didn't see that. Go on for it.
Okay. So there's a couple of questions from Ssozi, and I really apologize for my pronunciation. So the first question is about a lack of policy for the unorganised sector, and apparently there has been a Bangalore South MP speak for and constantly tweet about startup culture in Bangalore. So Ssozi thinks that this furthers the winner-takes-all syndrome, where people feel entitled to their success and don't recognise the intersectional advantage that you talk about. So she'd like to know what you think about that. And there's also a question about whether TikTok has kind of democratized the digital, because a lot of daily wage laborers are active users of TikTok. So, what you might think of the impact of the sudden ban of that on digital space. There was one other question from Megan. Should we save that for
yeah, I think we may. Balaji is getting quite a lot there. So yes. Balaji, those 2 for now, and then maybe Megan and Balaji in the break, you kind of connect.
Okay. I would like, Shruti to say, see, yes, it's true that there have been all these things coming out saying about the startup culture here, etc. But when you say it doesn't, it says this furthers the winner-take-all syndrome. Yes, I agree, where people feel entitled to success and don't recognize the intersectional advantage that you talk about. I'm not sure what that term means. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Shruti, when you talk about the intersectional advantage that you're invoking.
The intersectional advantage is the privilege that they come from, including caste and class, which is why they get the sort of education that they do. So, and then they go on to, achieve what they do, but they really say it's because of their merit that they reached where they did.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you and I are in agreement on that matter, because I do think that, there is this still, I remember Matt in his presentation talked about this whole, optimism, this cheerleading really that was in Bangalore, particularly in the 1990s, about this being almost manna from heaven, information technology, the other way the country. Now we're seeing sort of some of the darker sides, or we were increasingly seeing some of the darker sides of this, and it's manifest and evident. And yes, people don't recognize or very easily overlook these aspects when they talk about, or they go gushing about the unicorns that many of these platform firms are, or how they're sort of providing employment to the underprivileged, etc. When really the conditions under which these are taking place leave a lot to be desired, to put it very mildly. As for the TikTok question, yes, it is widely used. The ban took place, 48 hours ago. For those of you who don't know, this is a bit of a tussle going on up in the northern part of the country along the Himalayas, and so this is, or sort of getting back at China or whatever. But the thing is, that's an empirical question. We really need to wait and see what happens. It's too soon to be able to say what the outcome is going to be. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Okay. I suggest we take one or two more questions. So Hannah, what would you like to highlight? Or has somebody got their hands raised?
So yes, Claire Forster has her hand raised.
There we go.
Okay, so I'm just hoping that my, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Claire.
Because I'm unfortunately not blessed with technology that loves me. But anyway, so I've also posted my question into the chat room. So I was asking, I've got tons of questions, but for now I'm focusing on Fiona first. I would like to get a little bit more of an insider insight into how your participants contributed to the co-designing of your research studies. And also with regards to your comment about witchcraft beliefs and other spiritual, let's say, add-ons to technology or media that come from the community. I was wondering, perhaps, if you include those beliefs and associations with certain, let's say, quote-unquote Western technologies, if you use that in co-designing processes, maybe we can, as researchers, find out novel interpretations of what we take for granted. And yeah, so I would be intrigued to learn if you have found any of that insight coming from the vernacular wisdoms of your communities in your work. Thank you.
Great, and maybe I can put a rider on that. Jess, I wasn't clear whether you use participatory methodologies as well. If you wanted to kind of comment there as well, it might be an interesting complementary perspective. So first to Fiona and then maybe to Jess.
Hi, if I could just respond about on the how my participants engage in the co-design. So it depends on so I do action research. So I basically have cycles planned for, and depending on what the objective is, if we're just going to do some contextual inquiry, or if we're going to actually come up with a design or an interface of, of a tool, or if it's just going to be a bit of evaluation and doing a redesign of, the interface, or just having a discussion on user experience. So it depends on the objective of that particular cycle. But I always try to plan for the workshops, and I send information beforehand to, I have a, what you'd call a champion, or someone that have an intermediary. And so I have students or dairy farmers or water managers all contributing to, what they want, or it could just be information flow, or it could be appearance of, you know, the user interface, or what the icons should be and what they mean for them. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered you. At the bit about witchcraft, for me, it is more about understanding the environment within which this technology is situated and where the people are coming from, and basically understanding what the effect these issues or these concerns within the environment can have on either the uptake of the technology or them just abandoning it, and also just and these things informing the shape that the technology takes. And so if someone tells me that I am not able to take this device with me home, and then I'm asking, but why? And then she tells me, because when I go home, I'm just going to be locked up, or when I go home, I'm not allowed to even engage with anyone else within my community because of my disability, or because, you know, maybe I'm a woman and so the phone is going to be taken away by my husband. So for me, it is more, it helps me inform, you know, certain decisions that I have to take with regards to what's really appropriate, or how to even shape it further, or how to maybe abandon it altogether.
Thank you, Fiona. And Jess, did you want to jump in there, or?
Yeah, sure, thanks. It's a really interesting question, Dorothea. This research that I reported on tonight, your afternoon time, comes from a suite of research that has had a couple of stages. And so in the first stage, we transformed a unit that was offered for third year internal and external students, and then master's students at the same time, to being a flipped classroom or a blended learning kind of a unit. And in that process, we had a student who we hired as a researcher with us. We got some money from the university to do that. And that was a really nice opportunity to get someone who had graduated from the unit the year before to reflect on how the unit went. And then in the next stage of the research, we also involved students who are actually doing the unit in the writing of a research paper that was published in Geoforum that was talking about decolonising learning and whether you can do that in a neoliberal environment. And so this bit of research, the most recent stage, was conceived about a month before the semester started. So it was very a short run up, and there was no opportunity to do any co-design substantially. But I think the students became co-participants in the research by their activity within it, and whether they chose to do the survey or not, whether they chose to do the VR activities or not. I couldn't force anyone to put on a VR headset. I invited them. Some people walked away, didn't want to do it. Some people didn't want to take their makeup off. Some people thought it might make them too nauseous. So it was really interesting to see how people selectively engaged with the research process.
Thank you. And please feel free just to post the link to that article into the chat. I'd be really grateful if you would.